Thank you all very much for coming. I know there are many competing enticements for Wednesday afternoon, and I'm glad you're here. On the cool, sunny afternoon of May 25th, 1903, James delivered an address in Concord, Massachusetts, to commemorate the centenary of Emerson's birth. In January, when the social circle of Concord extended the invitation, he had declined. 6 years earlier, he could not help but remember he had suffered overwhelming anxiety before his oration at the unveiling of St. Gaudens's memorial to the slain Union hero Robert Gould Shaw. "Didn't we agree," he wrote to his wife, explaining his refusal for the Emerson talk, that one trial was enough for life? He had other reasons besides. Those commemorative public occasions seemed to him excessive, bloated, insincere, filled with platitudes. And he had better things to do than reread the works of Emerson, which seemed to him required for the task. He wanted, he said, to start my own final, and I should like to believe magnum opus, a general treatise on the sort of pluralistic and radically empirical philosophy in which I find myself more and more acquiring confidence. Yet after a few weeks of considering the invitation, urged by Alice, he agreed to participate. For the rest of the winter, James read Emerson, a man who had been a close family friend during all of James's youth, a man who, family legend had it, blessed him in his infancy. Emerson had died in 1882, a few months after James's mother Mary died, 8 months before Henry Sr. died, and in the same season as James's second son, William, was born. Now in 1903, William had reached his majority. "You can do anything now without asking our permission," James wrote William on his birthday. "And on the other hand, we are not obliged to support you any longer." His child had grown into adulthood since Emerson died, and James, now 61, had published 4 books: The Principles of Psychology early in his career, Varieties of Religious Experience just the year before, and 2 collections of talks, The Will to Believe and Other Essays in Popular Psychology, and talks to teachers on psychology and to students on some of life's ideals. He had published scores of articles as well and delivered talks not collected in the 2 volumes, but astoundingly, his major books lay ahead of him, and he felt that time was short. Beset by heart problems, he was certain he was nearing the end of his career. When he stood before the assembled group at the old meeting house in Concord, death was on his mind. "The pathos of death is this," he said, "that when the days of one's life are ended, what remains of one in memory should usually be so slight a thing. The phantom of an attitude, the echo of a certain mode of thought, a few pages of print, some invention or some victory, gained in a brief critical hour, are all that can survive the best of us." What would be left of his own life? What would be victorious over the inevitable pity of such a diminution and abridgment? Would he be remembered 100 years after his birth? These are the questions that haunt the Emerson address. The commemoration on May 25th was ample evidence that Emerson had achieved victory over oblivion. As befitting the occasion, James praised Emerson that fine day. Yet even though he thought some of his writings divine, he complained to Hugo Münsterberg, "There are so few things in Emerson anyhow." "Rarely has a man so accurately known the limits of his genius or so unfailingly kept within them," he said in Concord, meaning this as a compliment. James explored that genius as far as it went in an address that rose certainly to Emerson's matchless eloquence. He was an artist, James said, whose medium was verbal and who wrought in spiritual material. But he felt more certain than ever his impatience with the transcendentalist and Platonic phrases that expressed Emerson's view of the universe. His conviction that the great cosmic intellect terminates and houses itself in mortal men. his certainty that the spirit of the world guides each individual's sense of vocation. Yet here was Emerson being heralded all over New England in a spate of events. That very morning, 600 school children had gathered in Concord to pay homage. Perhaps it was a bit of competitiveness then that inspired James to dedicate himself to his own writing, to refuse distractions. In short, to emulate Emerson and simplify his life for the one remaining thing he wrote to his brother, which is to report in one book at least such impression as my own intellect has received from the universe. Certainly by the time he wrote these words, James had become a prominent intellectual and popular public speaker. His most notable professional work was in psychology. Besides the hefty principles, he had published about 20 articles on the mind. Although most of his talks occurred within the academy, at Yale, Princeton, Brown, for example, and before professional organizations, in 1895 he delivered a course of lectures to school teachers, translating psychological concepts as they might apply in the classroom, first at the Harvard Summer School and later in Connecticut and Colorado. But the transitions in his intellectual life, from art to science, science to medicine, medicine to physiology, and then to psychology, were still evolving. His interest in psychical research and his enduring inquiry into religious experience were compelling. His abiding questions about the meaning of truth and the method for ascertaining truth beset him. Still, he felt compelled to deal with what he called the moral business bequeathed by his father. Still, he felt the need to bring science back to its origins in philosophy. There was so little time and so much ambition. James was not a modest man, and his need for public recognition was great. When his friend Thomas Davidson died in 1900, he eulogized him in letters and an eloquent essay. What James admired about Davidson was his good fellowship, wide-ranging erudition, and most of all, his independence. I think of him as the very incarnation of friendly delight in human individuals, he wrote to a friend, granting that Davidson could be a prickly companion. If one asks now what the value of Thomas Davidson was, apart from his particular books and articles, I have to say that it lay in the example he set to all of us of how, even in the midst of intensely worldly social system of ours, in which each human interest is organized so collectively and so commercially, a single man may still be a knight-errant of the intellectual life and preserve full freedom in the midst of sociability. He remembered 20 maxims that Davidson put forth. Here is one. Do not believe that all greatness and heroism are in the past. Learn to discover princes, prophets, heroes, and saints among the people about you. Be assured they are there. But here is another, more relevant to James. Seek enjoyment in energy, not in dalliance. Our worth is measured solely by what we do. I am convinced, James wrote to his friend Sarah Whitman a few weeks after the Emerson address, that the desire to formulate truths is a virulent disease. It has contracted an alliance lately in me with a feverish personal ambition, which I never had before. He always had a feverish personal ambition, and which I recognize as an unholy thing in such a connection. I actually dread to die until I have settled the universe's hash in one more book. But a year later, hoping he would have hundreds of pages written, he confessed to a friend that he had only 32. He had not managed to evade distractions, and his health was poor. My arteries are senile, and none of my ancestors, so far as I know of them, have lived past 72, many of them dying much earlier, he added to Whitman. And all I fear is that the angel of death may overtake me before I can get my thoughts on paper. He got other thoughts on paper, to be sure. The last decade of his life, and the last 7 years particularly, were astoundingly productive. Does consciousness exist, a world of pure experience? How two minds can know one thing? Is radical empiricism solipsistic, the moral equivalent of war? Pragmatism, a pluralistic universe, the meaning of truth? But these books were not all that he wanted to say. They were not enough, not clear enough, for one thing, to the professional colleagues whose esteem he coveted, and they were not capacious enough. I want to write and publish, if I can do it, another immortal work, he wrote to his brother Henry, less popular but more original than pragmatism, which latter no one seems rightly to understand, representing it as a philosophy got up for the use of engineers, electricians, and doctors, whereas it really grew up from a more subtle and theoretical analysis of the function of knowing than previous philosophers had been willing to make. I know that it will end by winning its ways and triumphing. James died believing that his work was incomplete. He had not finished the book that he hoped would round out his system, which, he said, now is too much like an arch built only on one side. His pragmatism, delivered as lectures, was deemed by some philosophers to be so shockingly popular that it could not be taken seriously. The Meaning of Truth, a collection mostly of articles published in philosophical journals, was addressed to his professional colleagues, but James was not confident that it adequately settled the universe's hash. His final book, which James hoped would quash criticism, was addressed to students, an introductory textbook on metaphysics. We can see in James's lecture notes from his last years of teaching assertions, references, and explanations that went directly into this manuscript. And we can guess that his students' questions and responses helped him work out his ideas. By keeping this readership in mind, James could anticipate the confusions and misunderstandings that would arise from even the most rudimentary philosophical thinker, and from his critical colleagues. Students, after all, might be more open to his ideas. He believed that this new generation understood, as perhaps his colleagues refused to admit, that life is confused and superabundant, he said. And he believed that what these younger people craved is more of the temperament of life in its philosophy, even though, he added, it were at some cost of logical vigor and of formal purity. Like James himself, they yearned for a landscape less clipped, straight-edged, and artificial than ones envisioned by other philosophers. The most moving article in this exhibition for me is the manila envelope in which James carried this last manuscript to and from Europe. Tattered and torn, the envelope tells a story in itself of James's investment in the book that would offer his final answers to broad and deep metaphysical questions. What are thoughts and what are things, and how are they connected? What do we mean when we say truth? How comes there to be a world at all? What is God, or the gods? And the three metaphysical questions posed so succinctly by Kant: what can I know? What should I do? What may I hope? At James's last class, he was touched by his students' acclaim and their gift of a silver inkwell. Harvard was not given to gushing, he said. I think James would not have believed that 100 years after his death, we would gather here to celebrate him. I think that he did not expect an exhibition dedicated to him at the Houghton Library, nor, of course, an online exhibition that will be available, so I'm told, forever. Forever was the word that gnawed at his consciousness in 1903, and it is the word that underlies any celebration of his life. We cannot know what will endure forever, but what of James endures for us. We're left with memories of many who knew him, and those memories conjure up an image of James in motion, energetic, restless even, and curious. George Herbert Palmer, James's exact contemporary and Harvard colleague, noted, like many who knew James, his upright bearing, swift step, charm, playfulness, and eager interest in all the world was doing. And he also noted his capriciousness, even as a classroom lecturer. We used laughingly to say that you could not tell what beliefs James would hold today, but only that they would be different from those of last week. Santayana said that James's lectures were not minutely prepared. Know your subject thoroughly, he used to say, and trust to luck for the rest. You can see that we're in a room of academics here. And Santayana added famously, his excursions into philosophy were accordingly in the nature of raids. One of his students, Dickinson Miller, said that James seldom followed for long an orderly system of argument or unfolding of a theory, and was apt to punctuate his lectures with not a few ifs and maybes. Some students were annoyed. All were invariably charmed. Royce in lecture sat immovable, Miller remembered. James would rise with a peculiar suddenness and make bold and rapid strokes for a diagram on the blackboard. Royce himself said that he never knew what to think about current events or new problems until he listened to James's first absolutely spontaneous comment upon it. Comments that were like lightning, but instead of destroying, they illuminated. Flournoy called James an artist in his extraordinarily vivid and delicate feeling for concrete realities, his penetrating vision in the realm of the particular, and his aptitude for seizing on that which was characteristic and unique in everything that he met. Everything that he met went beyond the material to what Flournoy called the life of the soul. Canning Schiller, James's admirer and often consoler, remarked upon James's marvelous gift of psychological sympathy in dealing with nearly everyone. He asks us to remember that James was never trained as a philosopher, unless one counts being brought up by his father, and therefore came to academic philosophy with a virgin freshness that allowed philosophy for him to embrace psychology. That is, the practice and experience of thinking. Pragmatism, Schiller said, reinstated life in its integrity as the supreme aim of philosophic thought. By refusing to take meaning, use, and value as three unrelated notions, pragmatism, he said, enabled philosophers to understand the process by which truths are in real life actually established, developed, and, if need be, modified and scrapped. Pragmatism depended on and drew from James's training as a scientist. James's students, the readership of his proposed final book, lived in a world in which science claimed increasing and increasingly publicized authority. Since 1840, when the word scientist first entered the English language, the enterprise of investigators into the natural material world had become more and more specialized. 19th century naturalists, observing, categorizing, sketching, collecting, all the while hoping to establish what Emerson called the occult relation among all natural phenomena, these inquirers seem quaint compared with researchers who sharpened a particular and partial view of nature according to their special vantage. A botanist or physiologist or chemist proposed one theory and another, fragmenting rather than unifying an understanding of nature. In James's time, from the time he began teaching anatomy until his retirement from teaching philosophy, more than 200 professional associations were founded, spewing forth expert opinions that often contradicted one another, supported by evidence that the public and even professional colleagues felt inadequate to evaluate. The aura of science certainly made its way into the popular mind. The immense amount of valuable knowledge now afloat in society enriches the newspapers, Emerson wrote sardonically as early as 1848, so that one cannot snatch an old newspaper to wrap his shoes in without his eye being caught by some paragraph of precious science out of London or Paris, which he hesitates to lose forever. My wife grows nervous when I give her waste paper, lest she is burning Holy Writ, and wishes to read it before she puts it under her pies. Scientific expertise seem increasingly to convince non-experts that investigating natural phenomena was an esoteric activity far superior to ordinary perception and experience. If James had believed this, he might have followed the path he began at the Lawrence Scientific School, or certainly the path he took when he made the transition from physiology to psychology, established a psychology laboratory, and wrote his textbook. Science's attack on personal authority troubled James, and his training as a scientist generated his profound skepticism. In the first half of the 19th century, he said, the promise of science was to express truths that were exact copies of a definite code of non-human realities. But by the beginning of the 20th century, so many geometries, this is what he said, so many logics, so many physical and chemical hypotheses, so many classifications had emerged, each one of them good for so much and yet not good for everything, that the notion that even the truest formula may be a human device and not a literal transcript has dawned upon us. Science, he said, was itself grounded in faith, that one method of verification involving repeated testing and gathering of empirical data would lead inevitably to a discovery of truth. Fondness for the word scientist, James wrote, is one of the notes by which you may know its votaries, and its short way of killing any opinion that it disbelieves is to call it unscientific. In the opening pages of his last book, James took on what he assumed were his students' objections to privileging philosophy over science as a method of arriving at truth. Science makes steady progress and reveals its findings through practical applications, these students believe. Science works in the real, tangible world. Scientific conclusions depend on empirical data rather than purely on reasoning. To this last objection, James argued, as he had before, that philosophy must complete the sciences and must incorporate their methods, becoming as hypothetical in her manners as the most empirical science of them all. Sorry, it's a sip of water time. By this he meant that philosophy, like science, must test propositions by examining the consequences in behavior, ethics, morality, and relationships with other people of holding those propositions. Just as James once said that the will to believe should more accurately have been titled The Right to Believe, his meaning of truth might have been titled The Value of Truth. The meaning of truth, the method of arriving at truth, the contesting arguments about truth, which so deeply concerned his contemporaries, these were only part of his effort in his last works. What James wanted to establish was the meaning of personal authority, the method of attaining that authority, and the faith that personal authority could and must lead to knowledge of reality. With each individual having a say or a vote in questions of truth, the universe would never be a closed entity, but always open, multifarious, and novel. Our thoughts determine our acts, he wrote, and our acts redetermine the previous nature of the world. Previous and future nature as well. If James believed that this was the philosophy his students yearned for, with their perceptions of a world in chaos, how much more do we yearn for this message in a world that seems even more chaotic, confused, and, as James put it, superabundant, where sources of authority are repeatedly undermined, where we need constant reassurance to have faith in our own perceptions. James's reassurance earned him the reputation of being tolerant and affirming, and of legitimizing not a few crackpots. It was impossible not to be morally elevated by the smallest contact with William James, his friend John J. Chapman wrote. Celebrating the individual and exulting in the novel, James hoped to liberate his contemporaries from the constrictions of religious, moral, philosophical, and scientific systems that precluded action. He insisted on their right and ability to make decisions, to own their experiences, and to inquire into the meaning of those experiences. No other philosopher has translated experience into prose so evocative and exuberant. The rush of our thought forward through its fringes is the everlasting peculiarity of its life, he wrote in A Pluralistic Universe. We realize this life as something always off its balance, something in transition, something that shoots out of a darkness through a dawn into a brightness that we feel to be the dawn. Sometimes the dawn feels like fulfillment. Sometimes we think there is more to come. We sense our feelings as crescendos, pulsing forward, not as discrete atoms of experience. In the pulse of inner life immediately present, now in each one of us, is a little past, a little future, a little awareness of our own bodies, of each other's persons, of the Earth's geography and the direction of history, of truth and error, of good and bad, and of who knows how much more. This description was offered not merely to delineate the sensation of thought, but to lead us to the consequences of privileging the materialism that science demanded. Materialism holds the foreign in things to be more primary. No, materialism holds the foreign in things to be more primary and lasting, James wrote. It sends us to a lonely corner with our intimacy. From a pragmatic point of view, the difference between living against a background of foreignness and one of intimacy means the difference between a general habit of wariness and one of trust. James struggled with the problem of intimacy throughout his life. How was it possible to know another mind? How was it possible for two minds to have the same perceptions? How, in any case, would this identity be proved? The greatest breach in nature, he wrote, was the breach from one mind to another. There is a tragic undertone to this statement. His friend John Chapman noticed, despite James's playfulness, a deep sadness. You felt that he had just stepped out of this sadness in order to meet you, and was to go back into it the moment you left him. Chapman attributed this sadness to James's religious and philosophical burdens. But I think it was loneliness, the abiding recognition of that great, formidable breach. A centennial exhibition about James should not be a museum, and that, of course, is the risk when any life is distilled from artifacts and arranged under glass. I hope that the artifacts, though, suggest ways to consider James's intellectual choices and transitions, the context that shaped his understanding of his world, as well as the spontaneous, disorderly, insistent, peculiar, bold, and novel workings of his mind. James saw his life as undetermined, with fate always undecided and success never assured. In the transitional moments of his life, we can see his battles, sometimes public, often private, as he worked through vocational dilemmas, spiritual crises, philosophical problems, and crucial personal decisions. I hope the exhibition suggests something more besides, and that is to provide a glimpse into James's process of thinking. In choosing written material, whether manuscripts or books, I selected those that reveal James engaged as a reader and writer. We see marginal notes that read like outbursts, sometimes angry, sometimes incredulous, directed at the author. And we see James questioning the text. In manuscripts for his own talks and essays, we see words and phrases crossed out and revised. These moments when James spoke his mind or changed his mind seem particularly relevant to this exhibition, which argues that James was a thinker always in transition, trying to make his ideas more emphatic, focused, and clear. James's response to James B. Pratt's questionnaire on his religious experience, for example, has been published. But this document, showing James's answers in dark ink all over the questionnaire, with his characteristic exclamation points and underlinings, look like passionate outpourings. Is God very real to you as a real earthly friend, though different? Pratt asked. Dimly real, James responded. not as an earthly friend. Do you believe in personal immortality, Pratt asked. Never keenly, but more strongly as I grow older, James responded, because I am just getting fit to live. We have 12 volumes of James's correspondence, and even these do not represent everything in the archives. We have 17 volumes of James's work in the Harvard edition. Houghton, through the generosity of the James family, has a rich archive of James papers in which many of us have had the privilege of working. But the whole of James will never be known to us. For me, the most humbling item in the exhibition is the famous diary in which James confides his great dorsal collapse, his grief over the death of his cousin Mary Temple, and his rescue by Radium Renouvier. We show this diary open to pages that have been excised, pages containing other revelations, no doubt that someone, but who, wanted to be kept secret. Perhaps these were James's deepest feelings and most private thoughts. Perhaps these pages spoke of the darkness into which James, throughout his life, sometimes retreated. As a biographer, these pages represent the phantom, the echo, the ineffable trace of the life that still inspires us and inspires our gathering for this celebration. Thank you.
We have about 10 minutes for a few questions before proceeding over to the exhibition and a reception there. So if I might turn to the audience. Yes.
I just discovered William James a couple of years ago. The best purchase I made was the Collected Works. And him and Alfred North Whitehead inspired me to work on these essays I'm working on now. The thing I find most fascinating about William James is that he was doing all this stuff in the face of such empiricism. I mean all his colleagues that he respected, they were just saying things that they just didn't understand. I know sometimes it was muddled. I mean, the word was muddled, but he was onto something that his colleagues just completely refuted. And I just think the fact that he was doing it in the teeth of that stuff, empiricism, and that's why his radical empiricism is so much different than what they were doing. I just think he was brave, very courageous person.
He was brave. We would agree.
Even though James's principles of psychology in many ways read today as a thoroughly modern work, and a lot of his concepts have just been incorporated into modern scientific psychology, the striking difference is that James really was or wanted to be a dualist. He really believed in this realm of the spirit that couldn't completely be explained by brain physiology. And in that way, he's very unmodern, in that modern scientific psychology is completely monist. Would he, I mean, even though it's impossible really to answer this question, visualize...
Thank you for telling me that before I even died.
He had lived another couple of decades when it became more, when the whole drift of psychology was to move away from any of this spiritualist, seance, fairy dust world of spirit. How would he have dug in his heels and, you think, remained a dualist in spite of the way the field was going, especially given the resonance with his own life and his wish for immortality? Mm-hmm. Or can you imagine him saying, well, I was wrong, it's all neurons?
No, I can't imagine him saying, I was wrong, it was all neurons. I mean, of course, how do we know what he would say? I think he would have been fascinated by brain imaging, don't you think? I mean, he would have, because he loved inventions. You know, I think he would have loved plastic. But what do I know? I think, you know, many people often ask about Henry James versus William James in terms of their conception of psychology. I think that Henry James believed that through language you actually could express thinking. And I think William James thought not so much. Do you know that language fails us? when it really tries to capture what is going on inside. So in terms of his being a modernist, I think that Joyce, let's say, or whoever else was going to try, Virginia Woolf, I think he would have thought, that's not really what I meant. That's not really getting it. It appears to get it, but it's not really getting it. And I think in that way, I hate to say this because I know what it will open up. I think James leaped to postmodernism. And I think the spiritual yearning would have found a place there. So I don't think he would have had to give it up. I think he would have found comrades. I don't know.
First, thank you for the talk. Can you describe in your research his motivation and his struggles for his work with the Society for Psychological Research?
Well, the motivation was partly personal, and then partly because he did feel that through scientific processes and investigation, something could be known about the immaterial world. So the original founders, and you'll see in the exhibit, there's a list of the original members, when the Society for Psychical Research first started, they were eminent scientists. So he wasn't alone in feeling that you could actually investigate this phenomena, or these phenomena, visit 1 million mediums and then find one that seemed to be legitimate. There was a lot of research with automatic writing. In fact, in the exhibit, there's a sample of automatic writing, which is just in time for Halloween, very weird. But, the possibility that there were ghosts, the possibility that you could get messages from the beyond. So that, there was a scientific belief in that sort of investigation. But on the personal level, the Jameses had lost its son. Their little child Herman had died, and Alice especially wanted to connect, find out that he was all right on the other side. And so some of the going to seances was motivated by that.
I knew a Cambridge matron who died in her 90s, who had, as a child, her mother had entertained Mrs. James, who she described as coming in voluminous black widow's weeds. But she said the kids used to hide behind the curtains because they expected Mr. James to contact Mrs. James, and they wanted to see it happen.
Yeah.
So in Cambridge, it was well known that, within the family there was this expectation that
Absolutely.
he would show up.
Absolutely. Yep. Well, what can I say?
Well, join me, please, in thanking Linda for
Thank you
such a
very
lovely